Hey, it's Nick again, and I'm back with part 3 and hopefully the last segment of my demonstration of the client-server application that we're using to send XML information back and forth between multiple clients and a server. And we left off at the part here where we were about to look at the login server protocol. And this is one of our very important classes in the application. This is what the server uses to process the request that it gets from the client. So let's go look at this. After we create this object, we're going to have the protocol object. We're going to call protocol.process, and it's going to process that login request. And before we can get to that part though, we need to first actually read in some information from the client. So that's what we're doing here. We're using that object input stream, and we're reading in an object from the client. So the client is sending us an XML document, and once the server gets that, it's going to create this message object. And this message object is going to be that XML representation of a login request. So we need to turn that XML back into a regular object so that we can use the information in that object to query the server. And to do that, we're going to make use of the XML utility class again, and this time we're going XML to object instead of the first one we looked at was object to XML. So this time we need to go the other way, and we can figure out if it's a login request or a login response by getting the root element name. And when we create these objects, we're going to name these elements either that attribute, either login request or login response. So depending on which one we're looking at, we're going to process it differently. But on the server side, we're going to be looking at the login request, or turning it into a login request. And that's pretty easy. All we've got to do is strip out some of the information from that XML document. We're going to get the PIN and the account ID, and we're going to return a new login request object that we're using the PIN and the account ID to create that object. So that was pretty easy. Send back an ATM object, which is a login request or login response. So now we've got that here. And then I'm just going to cast it to a login request to make sure that we've got the right object here that we're going to deal with. And request from client received. So at this point we know that we've received a request from the client, and we've been able to turn it into a login request object. And we need to process that login request, and we do that by using our login server protocol class. And we're going to go look at that class now. This process is going to generate another document for us. This document is going to be an XML representation of a login response, which the server is going to send back to the client. And at this point, what all this is doing is taking the login request information, querying the database for that login information to find out if the database has a record that is valid for that information. And either way, the server is going to create a document that says yes, it's valid, or no, it's not valid. So that's what all of this is doing here. You can see we've got data access class, and I created this in our data layer, and it's a class that's used for accessing our MySQL database. One of the methods in there is get authentication. So you pass in a PIN and an account ID, and that method is going to return a true or false value that tells us if the login was valid or not. So if it finds a record that matches, it'll return true. If not, it'll return false. So we're going to use that value, and we're using that value to create a login response object. So it's either going to be true or false. And we're using a system ID generator. We're using this class to get ourselves a unique session ID value for each thread. And once we have our login response, we're going to pass that into the XML utility. We're going to call that object to XML again, where in TCP client we passed in the login request. This time we're passing in a login response. And I'm not going to go back to that class, but it does the same thing. It just builds up a XML document that is a representation of the login response. And then we're going to return that response back. And once we have that response, remember in the first video I showed you on the server side, I was just printing out what the account ID and PIN was that the server received, just for validation on the server side to know that we were indeed getting the same information that the user or that the client sent to it. And then we're going to use that object output stream to output this response document back to the client. So that ties us all the way back to client, where we were waiting for a response from the server. And at this point, the client will have gotten its response. It's going to cast that to a document, and it's going to turn that document back into a login response object, and then it's going to read that login response object by calling a couple of the get methods to get information regarding the session ID and whether the information it had originally sent to the server was valid or not. So that completes the round trip, and that demonstrates how this application is using some of the Java built-in classes and some classes that I've created myself to create a basic client-server app that sends XML data back and forth between a server and multiple clients. So I know this was a pretty long presentation, but I wanted to be as thorough as I could. I didn't go into every single one of these classes, but there'll be a link on the site that has this whole project cleaned up a little bit, and it'll be in a form to where you'll be able to run it on your own machine if you'd like to try it out. And I'm going to just show the MySQL table real quick. I'm only making use of the account table, but you may also want to use the user table, and I will put up a couple SQL files that will create this schema and populate it with some data for you so that you can run it exactly the way I've demonstrated. So thanks for watching.